We are going to get started with the last talk today by Anna Jenkins from University of Pennsylvania, and she's going to be talking about Are Social Concepts Special?
Thank you. And probably it's a matter of degree, not yes or no. So thank you so much for coming back for the last talk of the day, and thanks so much to the organizers for inviting me to be here. It's been a really lovely and invigorating day so far. So a lot of my work starts from the observation that as we go through our lives, we run into a lot of these things. That's to say other people, and we constantly need to figure out how to navigate around them, not just physically, but also intellectually, how to psychologically navigate around other people. We have to make decisions like, should we ignore someone or listen to them? Who should we offer help to? Who should we ask for help? Who should we vote for? How much should we punish someone if they did something that we think is wrong? And in order to make these kinds of decisions, we don't just want to answer the same way for every single person. It's pretty clear that if we just said, give $5 to every person you meet, or trust no one, you wouldn't get very far. So somehow, we're able to tune our behavior very flexibly to interactions with different types of people in our environments in different contexts. So ideally, to do this sort of fine-tuning, we might know things like, does the other person actually need what they're asking for? So if someone stops you on the street and asks you for bus money, you might want to know, do they really need the money, or are they just trying to con you? If you're thinking about offering your help to someone in a way that is costly to you, you might want to know, is this the kind of person who's going to appreciate what I do for them and maybe reciprocate in the future? So when we're making what we're calling social decisions, we might ideally have access to the inner content of other people's minds, their mental states, their thoughts, beliefs, and preferences, and their personality traits. Are they a generous person? Are they a forgetful person? The really interesting challenge for cognition is that we don't have direct access to this information. So we have to rely on a suite of indirect cues to make inferences and predictions that can guide our behavior. So the ability through which we do this has gone by many different names, including theory of mind, adopting the intentional stance, or mind reading. The word I'm going to use today is mentalizing, in part because this is not making any particular theoretical claims about the processes through which we are arriving at these inferences. So I'll just say that in work that I'm not going to mostly talk about today, but I'm happy to discuss in Q&A, we've learned a lot about how aspects of the social context affect the processes that people use to make these kinds of inferences, and the outputs of those inferences, and how those in turn impact social decision making. But I want to take a step even further back and focus on a really fundamental question for the bulk of the talk today, which was nicely articulated by Ralph Adolphs 20 years ago in 2003, which is, are there processes, are there neural structures that are in some way designed, specialized, and best understood as subserving the perception of socially relevant stimuli and the guidance of social behavior? It's a huge question. Many decades of work have attempted to answer it. I'm not going to answer it completely today, but I am going to provide some interesting and provocative evidence that the answer to some portions of the brain for which it has been presumed that the answer to this question is yes, might actually not be best characterized as socially specific. So we'll go through this, and you'll learn what that means in just a second. So first, I'm going to review some evidence that social stuff might, in fact, be special in the mind. I'll talk about the social brain and some claims about domain specificity. Then I'm going to tell you about some brand new work that I'm very excited about, in which we reconsider this idea of social specialness in the mind from the perspective of uncertainty in social environments. And then at the end, very briefly, I'll talk about some efforts that we've made to integrate our understanding of, well, really, understand how the mind integrates both processes that might be more like domain-specific processes for social thinking, and more domain-general processes to guide this sort of amazing and sometimes detrimental flexibility in social behavior that we see in daily human life. So quick poll, raise your hand if you're familiar with this term, the social brain. Okay, wonderful. So I want to start our discussion of the social brain with a little brain puzzle. This is not a brain teaser, but a puzzle about the brain, which is why do humans have such big ones? So as many of you probably know, the brain has increased in size rapidly across hominid evolution. So this is going back to about 10 million years ago on the far left. up to approximately the present day on the far right. And you can see that things go along relatively uneventfully in terms of brain size for about 8 million years. And then there's this incredible couple of inflection points with rapid expansion of brain size from Homo habilis to Homo erectus, and then up through Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. So big brains are metabolically expensive. They won't arise just because they could. So an enduring question has been, what is the benefit that these bigger brains give human beings? And one interesting possible answer to this question that has been put forth by a variety of people in a variety of forms boils down to the idea that bigger hominid brains evolved primarily because they facilitated life in large and complex social groups. This is the alternative to the possibility that bigger brains evolved primarily because they allowed people to solve what are called ecological problems of a non-social nature, like remembering where good food can be found. And if you think about the complexity of the social structures in our daily lives that we have to use and constantly update in order to guide our behavior, it's pretty easy to see how that complexity might require extra brain power. So this is just a schematic. I didn't make this. I stole it from the internet that illustrates the kinds of complex relationships that many of us have to represent in daily life. Who's friends with whom, who used to be friends with whom, who has a secret about someone else that they shouldn't know that you know. So the point I want to make for now is that as the number of people in your social group increases, it's easy to see how this complexity of the, I will use the word only in the colloquial sense, representations that you need to maintain about your social world might increase dramatically. So that makes a prediction that has been borne out by at least some evidence that bigger-brained beings, especially beings with bigger neocortex, might be able to sustain life in larger social groups. So this is a plot that many of you probably recognize. It's in many of the intro textbooks these days, which plots the relationship between relative neocortex volume. That's relative because, of course, bigger animals have bigger brains and smaller animals have smaller brains, and it would be a mess to try to evaluate the relationship between absolute brain size and social group size. But if we look at basically how much bigger is your brain than it should be given your body size, or specifically how much bigger is your neocortex than it should be given your brain and body size, what we see is this really interesting positive relationship between larger brained beings and larger average social groups. And if you're wondering where humans fit in on this plot, it's at the very tippy top in the upper rightmost corner. We have the largest relative neocortex volume, and we live on average in the largest social groups. So this is broadly correlationally consistent with the idea that maybe larger brains help support life in larger groups. But of course, there are lots of reasons why you might see that correlation, even if there weren't a causal relationship. So this is consistent with the idea that social interaction is especially important to human life, which has been an observation made dating back as far as the 4th century BC. Aristotle noted that humans are by nature social animals. And over the intervening centuries, there's been a lot of evidence, including from neuroscience, that supports this idea that social relationships are incredibly important to human life. We know that deprivation of social interaction in the form of solitary confinement is considered a form of torture. There's recent evidence that deprivation of social interaction creates craving signatures. When you think about a person that resemble the craving signatures that you see when you think about food after being deprived of sustenance. And there are a variety of other pieces of information that point to the importance of social life for human functioning. There's also some very intriguing evidence that some of these regions that expanded most across hominin evolution are regions that tend to be engaged when we actually think about other people. So this is sometimes known as the social network or the social brain or the mentalizing network, and it includes regions like the dorsal and ventral aspects of the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate, the temporal parietal junction, and then a smattering of other regions, including the STS, that engage less and less consistently, so I'm going to stop the list there, but I'm not trying to exclude anyone's favorite brain region here. Okay. What's really interesting about this set of brain regions is that they are engaged when people think about the minds of others across a wide variety of forms of thinking about the minds of others. So these regions tend to engage when people attribute knowledge to another person, like determining whether someone would know the capital of Lithuania. They tend to engage when people attribute beliefs to other people. Did she think she was obeying the speed limit when she was pulled over by the traffic cop? Predicting other people's preferences, inferring their emotions, and also forming impressions of other people's personalities that have to do with how their minds might work, like how trustworthy is someone, how forgetful are they. So one of the most amazing things about this set of regions and its functional profile is that it's not only engaged when people do these things, but that it deactivates when people do really similar tasks that lack this mental component. Mental in the sense of attributing something mental to the inside of another person's mind. So I'll give you two examples of this just to make it really concrete. So one example, if I show you a photo of someone like this and ask you how pleased was this person when he had his photo taken, you could probably come to an estimate of what that is. How many of you, raise your hand if you think he's more pleased than unpleased? Raise your hand if you think he's more displeased than pleased. All right. And the non-responders will let you have a pass on this one, but the next time I ask a question, you'll have to respond. Okay, so great. So when you think about a question like that, most likely you will have engaged this set of brain regions associated with thinking about the contents of another person's mind, putting yourself in their mind or bringing their mind into yours. By contrast, I could show you the very same face and ask you a very similar question that still requires you to look at the physical features of the face and make a judgment, but I could ask you how symmetrical is this person's face. I won't ask for an answer here because this is my husband and I don't want to, do him a disservice. But so when you think about that question, on average, participants don't show activation in this set of regions, or at least they don't show it as much. Of course, it's not a binary comparison, but in contrast between the first task and the second task, you typically see robust engagement, robustly greater engagement of what we're calling the mentalizing network for thinking about how pleased someone was to have their photo taken compared to how symmetrical their face is. So again, very similar types of tasks, slightly different. Another striking example comes from what's called the false belief task. Many of you are probably familiar with this. It's adapted from the developmental literature. And these are scenarios in which a protagonist in the story develops a belief about the state of the world that participants know to be false. And so this task is really useful for distinguishing participants' own beliefs about the true state of the world from their assessments or their representations of the character's belief, which is false. So that's why false beliefs tend to be used in this task. So this task goes something like this. Jenny put her chocolate away in the cupboard. Then she went outside. Alan moved the chocolate from the cupboard into the fridge. Half an hour later, Jenny came back inside. And the question to you and to participants is, where does Jenny think her chocolate is? So where does Jenny think her chocolate is? In the cupboard. Great. So hold that thought. Keep the cupboard in mind. Now consider this comparison example. This is an example of the false photo task. So a photograph was taken of an apple hanging on a tree branch using an old film camera. The film took half an hour to develop. In the meantime, a strong wind blew the apple to the ground. And the question to you and to participants is, where's the apple in the photograph? So where's the apple in the photograph? On the branch, on the tree. Great. Okay, so both of these questions probably seem trivially easy to you. You can probably answer them without thinking very much. But what's really interesting is that when you compare activation in the brain, when people do the first type of task, the false belief task, to when they do the second type of task, the false photograph task, you see greater activation in this same set of brain regions, the mentalizing network, when people attribute an outdated representation to a person's mind than when they attribute an outdated representation to a computer or a camera, which is very interesting because of the structural similarities in these two tasks, but the difference in terms of the vessel to which the representation is attributed. So that's just to highlight the tight comparisons that have been made between inferences about mental states and inferences about what we'll call non-social or non-mental phenomena. So some people have taken that sort of evidence to suggest that there might be domain-specific processes or representations subserved by or housed in these regions of the mentalizing network. There are other sources of evidence besides neuroimaging. The ability to infer other people's mental states arises on a particular developmental timeline. There are conditions in which people seem to have selective atypicalities in the way that they attribute mental content to other people without atypicalities in related sorts of cognitive tasks, including in autism, atypical answers on the false photo task despite typical answers on the false belief task. So that's just a whirlwind overview to set the stage for this idea that this set of brain regions has been consistently associated with mentalizing compared to very tightly controlled non-mentalizing tasks. And there can be atypical performance on social cognitive tasks in cases where performance on very similar non-social tasks is typical. So the question we wanted to investigate is, to what extent do those observations reflect domain-specific processes and domain-specific atypicalities? So our starting point was to think that maybe there's something else that differentiates the social tasks, the social world, from the non-social world besides just the need to attribute content to minds per se. So to work our way into thinking about that, I'd like you to take a little trip into the mountains. It could be the mountains right here. These happen to be the North Cascades near Seattle, where I'm from. So imagine that you're walking in the mountains and you see something like this. And thank you, Moritz, for setting up this comparison beautifully in your last talk. So imagine you see a ball roll partway up the hill and then roll back down again. And my question to you is, how do you explain what happened at the moment when the ball stopped rolling up the hill and started rolling back down? What are some possible explanations? Great. What else? What was that? Oh, Alfonso, stop. Velocity was zero. Great. Anything else?
The invisible man kicked the ball.
Beautiful. Invisible man kicked the ball. That's a deliberately awkward silence. Thank you. Okay, so now I'd like you to consider a very similar situation in which a strikingly similar hill presents itself, and we see something like this, which is a person walk partway up, turn around, and walk back down. And now my question to you is, how do you explain what happened at the moment when the person stopped walking up the hill and started walking back down? What are some possible explanations? He forgot his wallet? Too exhausting. Tired? What else? Gravity. Great. Oh, come on, a few more. What was that? Wife calling, yes, great. Change his mind, yes. All right, this could have been a demonstration about how we all assumed that this person was male, but it's not. So what I want to highlight are a few differences that were nicely exemplified by your participation in my silly thought experiment here between the attributions that you made of the ball's behavior and the attributions that you made of the person's behavior. So one is that you were able to readily generate many more possible explanations of the human's behavior than of the ball's. So for the ball's behavior, we basically centered very quickly on gravity. There's one person centered gravity. Everyone looked like, well, that was what I was going to say, never mind, except for a few very clever and creative responses. I would also argue that we can be less certain that any one of those explanations of the person's behavior is the correct one, whereas for the ball's behavior, we're pretty confident that it was probably something about velocity, momentum, gravity that caused it to roll back down the hill. It could have been remote controlled or something like that, but most people tend to think that their explanation of gravity for the ball rolling back down the hill is probably correct, whereas we have no idea what might have caused the human behavior, or which of those many possible explanations might be the correct one for the human. And interestingly, you could generate the ball explanation based on known laws of physics, but where did the human explanation come from? So that's a question that research has spent many decades trying to understand. How is it that we bridge the gap between our own minds and another mind to understand what's going on in someone else's head when their body changes direction or they start moving towards us? And the specific question that I want to address today, motivated in part by sort of anecdotal observations, is to what extent greater uncertainty that might be inherent to the social world account for the differences in brain activation and performance on cognitive tasks that we tend to see in the social versus non-social domains. So I launched into this question with my then graduate student, now postdoc, 𝗔𝗶_𝗶𝗀, who took the lead on this work. And I'm going to tell you briefly about our first foray into this area, which is a reconsideration of past findings to try to understand to what extent tasks used in past literature were basically confounded with uncertainty. And then a brand new fMRI study that has some very intriguing evidence about the degree to which some regions of the social brain might respond to uncertainty in a domain general fashion. So the initial way we started this project was to collect oodles of studies that had compared social to non-social tasks in a variety of domains. And we collected studies of 3 types. So we looked at studies that contained within one study a social versus non-social comparison, like those 2 examples we went through of how pleased the person was to have his photograph taken versus how symmetrical his face was, or the false belief versus the false photo task. We also collected studies that we thought might have inadvertently manipulated uncertainty within the social domain. For example, mentalizing about someone who's familiar to you versus someone who's unfamiliar to you. And then we also collected a smattering of studies that had a high versus low uncertainty manipulation within the non-social domain, having nothing to do with people, but manipulating uncertainty. We presented written descriptions of each of the conditions in each of these tasks to a new set of participants and asked them a variety of questions focusing on how much uncertainty they perceived in those conditions. So first I'll just show you overall how much uncertainty did people tend to perceive in the tasks that had a mentalizing component versus their non-social comparison counterparts. And that looks like this. So setting aside the differences in variance, which is sort of interesting in its own right, we see significantly higher uncertainty ratings associated with the social tasks compared to their non-social comparison tasks. It was actually the case that in all but one study, higher uncertainty ratings were associated with the social compared to the non-social condition. Then we wanted to look onto the brain and see where these activations tended to be reported. So interestingly, we saw a convergence in one region of the mentalizing network, which is the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. You can extend that this extends somewhat more dorsally than the typical sort of DMPFC that we see in mentalizing studies, but it certainly covers much of it as well. So in green, we have the social versus non-social comparisons. That's false belief versus false photo, how pleased versus how symmetrical. In blue, we have in the social domain tasks that we thought might have been more uncertain versus more certain, and then in red, in the non-social domain, having nothing to do with people or minds, higher versus lower uncertainty tasks. We can also turn this around and say for each study that saw a difference in DMPFC activation, how were the comparison conditions rated on uncertainty? So I'm going to plot on the right the condition in the study that had higher DMPFC activation, and on the left, the condition in the study that had lower DMPFC activation, and on the y-axis, I'll plot the uncertainty rating of our new participants for those tasks. So what we see is whatever the task was, if it was associated with higher DMPFC activation, those were tasks that our new participants rated as having more uncertainty. So all of this is sort of triangulating, albeit in a very tenuous way so far, on the possibility that maybe one region of the so-called social brain might not be so social, that maybe this region of the social brain is tracking with uncertainty. So we've certainly seen that uncertainty has been confounded with comparisons of social to non-social thinking in past studies, and that this one region, the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, is a candidate region that might be sensitive to uncertainty rather than social context. So this is broadly consistent with the possibility that maybe DMPFC activations that have appeared to be selective for social thinking actually reflect domain general contributions to something having to do with uncertainty processing or uncertainty reduction, something that comes along with or is triggered by elevated uncertainty in the environment. But we wanted to test that more directly, so that was what we did next. So one of the key features of mentalizing is generalizing from what we do know to make inferences about what we don't know, what's unknown or what's uncertain. So you might wonder, given a person's behavior in the context, what was their intention? Or if you know that they have one type of attribute, what's the likelihood that they also have another type of attribute when you're deciding how to behave toward them? So we capitalized on this general set of operations to create a set of social and non-social conditions that were matched in every possible way and across which we could manipulate uncertainty parametrically. So in past studies looking at uncertainty, to the extent that it has been investigated at all with respect to social cognition, it's typically just a binary comparison between higher versus lower levels, which itself, because it could introduce many confounds as well. So we wanted to manipulate this in a continuous way. So we have three conditions. One is a mentalizing condition having to do with people's personalities. So the way this works is participants are first presented with an attribute of a person, and they're told that this person has this attribute. So someone is smart, and then they're asked, in the face of a second attribute, given that they have the first attribute, how likely is it that they also have the second? So in this case, given that someone is smart, how likely are they also to be sincere? We created a human non-mental condition for our main comparison, which is a physical condition. So given that someone has an athletic build, how likely are they to be bony? There are others that are, given that this person is redheaded, how likely are they to be freckled, et cetera. So in the middle, we have the furniture condition, which is completely non-human and non-mental. So for example, given that something is wooden, how likely is it to be pliable, or how likely is it to be expensive? So what this allowed us to do is manipulate uncertainty very carefully across the stimuli within each condition. So what I'm going to show you now is just the relationship between our fMRI participants' ratings of the diagnosticity of one attribute for the other and a set of independent raters' ratings. So people tend to agree on how uncertain a judgment about how sincere someone is, given that they're smart, is. At least well enough for us to use the average of the independent raters' ratings as predictors in our fMRI analysis. So the first thing that we did, the first thing I'm going to tell you about is we wanted to know, are there any regions in the brain that track with uncertainty across conditions? Just disregarding the condition manipulation, whether it's a mental inference, whether it's a human physical inference, whether it's an inference about attributes of furniture, are there any regions in the brain that track parametrically with how uncertain people are about the inference? And the answer was exactly one region, and that region was DMPFC. This extends, obviously, dorsally and posteriorly, but it also includes, and we have tested it in a variety of ways, some of which I'll tell you about in a minute, the robustness of the result in DMPFC itself. So this whole brain analysis is based on the mean diagnosticity ratings of participants. So given that you know someone is smart, how confident, how sure would you be about how kind they are? But we can operationalize uncertainty in a few different ways, right? So there could be something specific to that operationalization that's giving us this region. So I'll tell you about two different ways that we operationalized uncertainty. One is just to use the trial-by-trial response extremity for each participant and use their own ratings as parametric modulators of the bold signal for their own data. So participants responded to all of these questions on a 1 to 4 rating scale. Given that someone's smart, how likely are they to also be kind? So we can take intermediate responses of 2 and 3 as reflecting greater uncertainty about that question than extreme responses of 1 and 4. When we do that, we also see exactly one region, which is DMPFC, just in a contrast of 2 and 3 versus 1 and 4. Another way that we operationalized uncertainty is using measures of semantic distance from word embeddings models, word-to-vec model, in large-scale text corpora. So for this, we didn't need to do anything particularly fancy, so we used the good old tried-and-true 300-dimensional space from Google News. So this is, for those of you who don't know, a corpus of all articles ever archived by Google News, and the model is trained on word co-occurrence data. So words that tend to co-occur in similar contexts end up closer to each other in this space, and the space is organized by 300 dimensions. So for example, in this space, sincere and compassionate are closer to each other than smart and compassionate are, and we can quantify using a measure of Euclidean distance or cosine similarity, which in this case are identical because it's a standardized space, to give us a precise value of the degree to which those two words or constructs are similar to each other. So we reasoned that words that occur in greater proximity to each other would be more diagnostic of each other. So sincere, by virtue of being closer to compassionate, would give you more diagnostic purchase on how compassionate someone is than smart would, by virtue of being further from compassionate. So when we use cosine similarity or Euclidean distance from this word-to-vec model for all of our word pairs and use that as a parametric modulator on the bold response, we see once again the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex tracking with greater semantic distance, which is to say greater uncertainty or hypothesized uncertainty in terms of the generalization from attribute 1 to attribute 2, and we see that across all categories. Okay, so at this point, some of you might be sitting on your hands thinking, but what is this really the DMPFC region that we think responds to social versus non-social stuff? Maybe this is, all driven by ACC or pre-SMA, which we know have roles in uncertainty processing. So to get some purchase on whether what we're seeing is a response to uncertainty in a brain region that is known to respond more to mental than non-mental inferences, we used a set of a priori regions of interest from another research group. This is from Rebecca Sachs's group. And this is a few hundred participants worth of data, all using the false belief versus false photo task. So these regions of interest come from the Sachs data set, and we looked in these regions that consistently respond more to mental and non-mental inferences to see how they responded, if at all, to uncertainty. And what we see when we do this analysis is that only the DMPFC showed a positive parametric response to uncertainty. So this is in a region of the so-called social brain, very consistently associated with mental inferences more than physical inferences. And here we're showing across categories, mental, human physical, and furniture, this region tracks very nicely with the degree of uncertainty around the inference. And we replicate this for all three measures of uncertainty. This is the data from the diagnosticity ratings, but it looks just the same when you do it with the extremity ratings or the word-to-vec model. Interestingly, I'll just note that VMPFC actually shows the opposite response with greater response to greater certainty. That is, higher uncertainty is associated with lower response in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, which I'll just set aside for the moment, but food for thought. So DMPFC seems to respond positively to uncertainty. None of the other regions of the mentalizing network do. So it doesn't seem to be the case that uncertainty accounts for the entirety of the social brain's activations in social compared to non-social contexts. It seems like it maybe accounts for the activation of one of them. So there's one other way that we can, at least one other way that we can think about this, which is in these tasks, we've effectively controlled for uncertainty. So when controlling for uncertainty, if it's the case that DMPFC's response is explained by uncertainty, then the social versus non-social comparison should no longer show any activation in DMPFC. So when we run just a contrast between human mental versus human physical, which has over and over and over and over and over and over again showed greater activation in this set of regions, including the DMPFC, what do we find when uncertainty is controlled for? Sorry. Less dramatic than it could have been. No difference to the social, that is the mental condition versus the physical condition in DMPFC, but confirming that we did in fact manipulate whether people were thinking about minds versus non-mental stuff, we do still see a difference in both left and right TPJ for greater activation in thinking about people's minds than thinking about people's physical attributes. So this is a very contrived task. We've stripped down so many things that are interesting about the social world in order to equate our social and non-social conditions. So maybe we've just found something that's sort of specific to this task and doesn't generalize to more complex stimuli or naturalistic environments. So as an initial way of testing how generalizable this might be, I'm going to show you data that were collected in collaboration with a colleague of mine as an adult comparison condition for a kids study. But it turns out that this movie, Piper, it's about this little bird. I'll refrain from showing it to you because it would take the rest of our time. It naturally varies in both how social the scenes are and how much uncertainty tends to arise in those scenes. I will say we did not select this for those attributes, so it's an opportunistic analysis, but an opportunity that we wanted to take because we scanned this in the same participants who did our fMRI uncertainty task. So we had independent raters go through and code each segment of this little film in terms of how much social content there was and also how much uncertainty there was. These are very preliminary. We haven't written these up for publication, but I just want to show you because I'm very excited by them. What we see is in the DMPFC region of interest from past mentalizing tasks that I showed you before, greater activation to the moments in the video that our independent raters coded as more uncertain compared to the ones that they coded as more certain. So when I was introducing this idea of domain specificity around social cognition, one of the sets of findings I mentioned had to do with autism and the observation that autistic individuals can often perform quite well in something like the false photo task, despite atypical performance in a false belief task. So one of the exciting directions that we're pursuing in this work is to try to understand to what extent atypical social reasoning in conditions like autism might be explained by uncertainty aversion or differences in uncertainty processing. So as an initial step in the direction of answering that question, we had the participants in this study take a self-reported autism questionnaire. And if we look in those participants for this same comparison, what we see, so in the orange are participants who score high on the autism quotient, which is a measure of autism. We're also using the SRS, but not in this data collection. In the blue are low AQ participants. And what we see is a blunted distinction between the uncertain and certain blocks in autism. Okay, so patterns of DMPFC activation that have been previously assumed to reflect specialized social processes seem like it's possible that those might arise instead from domain general responses to uncertainty. Autism is associated with both structural and functional abnormalities in DMPFC, which I think is very intriguing in light of these results. And it suggests a possible reinterpretation of at least some of the putative social cognitive deficits in ASD. Obviously, it will take approximately a lifetime to find out how much this can account for those differences. But this also aligns with past work in ASD that finds elevated uncertainty aversion. So those two literatures have made approximately zero contact, but there's a consistent finding in autism of uncertainty aversion. There's consistent findings in autism of atypicalities in social thinking, and what we're starting to pursue is the possibility that those might not be independent features of autism, but they might be directly linked to each other, and that atypical ways of dealing with uncertainty might actually cause the social atypicalities. I do want to just point out again that activity in other regions of the so-called social brain was not explained by uncertainty. So the right and left TPJ, for example, still showed elevated responses to the mental versus the non-mental inferences in our task. So that means that at least my internal jury is still out on whether those regions are best understood as subserving domain-specific processes or housing domain-specific representations, or whether there's some other domain general property that might explain their activity. We have some other work pursuing other dimensions relevant to the TPJ, which I'd be happy to talk about in Q&A. All right. In the last couple of minutes, I'm going to give you the briefest glimpse of how we've started to integrate our understanding of domain-specific and domain general, possibly domain-specific and possibly domain general processes. So I've been focusing so far on inferences about the contents and qualities of other people's minds, on mentalizing, but that doesn't occur in a vacuum. So we've been talking about inferences about other people's traits, but presumably there are things that precede that, like cues to social group membership, which we know are powerful predictors of the types of traits that people will attribute to other people. And we've been working on understanding how representations of other people's traits combined with objective information about the decision options out in the world to guide social behavior. So one way that we've captured flexible social behavior is using a very boring task, which is a dictator game, in which participants are asked to allocate money between themselves and other people. So you start with $10 and you are asked to decide how much of the $10 would you give to someone else. And in our tasks, we provide them some piece of information about the other person, for example, their occupation or their nationality, sometimes both in work that I've done with Sharon, looking at how people combine different social concepts. And participants make these decisions about how much money to give. And they make different decisions for different targets. So it's not as though people just decide 5 is the right answer, I'll give 5 to everyone. Even based on these really minimal cues, people make different decisions about how much to give different people. So one way that we can organize the trait space for purposes of looking at representations of traits in the brain and how those might interact with other processes is using this two-dimensional framework from the stereotype content model, which reduces perceptions of other people's traits to 2 dimensions, one of which has to do with how good or bad that person's intentions are. Are they a kind, compassionate person, sometimes called warmth? And the other having to do with how capable that person is of acting on their intentions, sometimes called competence. So these are approximate representations of how members of different social groups tend to be perceived in general. So in an fMRI experiment, we asked participants to make these dictator game resource allocation decisions toward different counterparts identified by their occupations and nationalities. We used computational modeling to characterize the weight that people put on their own versus other people's outcomes under different forms of inequity, that is, as a function of whether they're getting more than the other person or the other person is getting more than them. I'm not going to go into the computational side of this for now, but I'm happy to answer questions about it. It's not important for understanding the main result. Interestingly, what we find is different effects of warmth and competence on people's willingness to impose unequal distributions as a function of whether the participant themselves is getting more or the other person is getting more. That's a lot of dependencies, so I'll just walk you through it very quickly. We see that warmth has the target's warmth has a big effect on how willing people are to take more than the other person. So the warmer someone else is, the less people want to take more than them. So I don't want to take 10 and give 0 to the adorable elderly Irish person, right? But competence doesn't have very much effect on people's willingness to impose unequal distributions when the participant is getting more. In contrast, for disadvantageous inequity, when the participant is going to get less than the other person, then the other person's competence really matters. And people do not like getting less than competent people. So people tend not to want to give 10 and take 0 when the other person is a surgeon or a lawyer. And if you're wondering if there's a wealth confound, there is, but it doesn't account for the entirety of the effect. Okay, so the interesting part for our purposes is, do any brain regions actually represent these traits in this two-dimensional space of warmth and competence during decision making? So I'm just going to go through this quickly. Happy to take questions. We create a representational dissimilarity matrix based on the proximity of every pair of targets in the two-dimensional space, and we ask, are there regions of the brain whose activity is correlated with that proximity using representational similarity analysis? So we see several brain regions that are associated with mentalizing or evaluation that in which the activation is predicted well by the representation of different targets in the warmth competence space. And then we wanted to look in those regions to see to what extent those regions' activity actually predict individual participants' behavior. So again, the behavior is context dependent. More generosity toward more warm people under advantageous inequity, but more generosity toward more competent people, less generosity toward more competent people under disadvantageous inequity. So a region that actually predicts behavior has to be very contextually sensitive. And what we see is that the brain regions associated with social cognition don't predict behavior. They house the representations of warmth and competence, but they don't allow us to predict this context-dependent behavior. But there's one region whose activity does allow us to predict behavior, and that's the lateral orbital frontal cortex, which is interesting by virtue of connecting to work on the role of the OFC in bringing in or incorporating inferred value into the decision process. So this is leading us toward a model where there might be possibly domain-specific representations of other people's traits in some regions associated with social cognition, like the temporal parietal junction. But then you have this objective information about your choice options. I haven't gone into how that is represented, but those might combine then and be integrated in sort of a common currency in the orbital frontal cortex to allow us this incredible flexibility that we see in how much of a given resource, for example, we might give to a given person in our daily life. So I hope I've convinced you, if you didn't already know, that other minds pose very special challenges for cognition. But whether those special challenges are met by a specialized set of processes is the key question that we wanted to investigate. And it looks like at least some of those regions' engagement during thinking about other minds might be better explained by the elevated uncertainty in the social world, the uncertainty around those inferences, than by the content, the social content of those inferences per se. And we saw that the outputs of those processes, or the putative outputs of those processes, seem to be integrated into valuation signals in OFC that will allow us to guide our flexible social behavior. So this is part of a broader effort to understand how contextual features in the environment affect cognitive processes and how the engagement of those different processes has consequences for behavior in the world. I'll just mention that we've found some other intriguing evidence for uncertainty being able to explain differences that we see in social versus non-social contexts, including differences in the way people explore social versus comparable non-social environments. So with that, I want to thank my lab, our funding sources, my collaborators. I have many questions about these data. I hope you do too. And so I will let you ask them now. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. That was really inspiring. So I was curious about this encoding in the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex of uncertainty. And you say this is domain general, but all your experiments were about valuations or judgments, actually. So I'm curious, in situations, in a situational context where I experience a level of uncertainty, would this region also encode these different, say, trials with different uncertainty? For example, if I'm in a classical queuing paradigm and the queue has a certain validity, so does this region also encode queue validity, for example?
Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, so I say domain general, but I have demonstrated domain generality within the context of a very specific task. So it seems to be domain general across inferences about minds, inferences about bodies, and inferences about furniture, but what about something like a queuing paradigm? So there are two different types of uncertainty that are talked about that I think are important for understanding what PFC is probably doing, and that distinction is often referred to as aleatory versus epistemic uncertainty. So there's aleatory uncertainty is like the uncertainty that comes from randomness. So the uncertainty that comes from not knowing whether on a given flip of a coin is it going to come up heads or tails. That's sometimes called irreducible uncertainty because there's no amount of information that you could get that would help you make a better prediction or reduce your uncertainty about whether the coin is going to come up heads or tails, unless it's like a weighted coin or something like that. epistemic uncertainty, this is thought to be reducible uncertainty, where more information could, in principle, reduce the uncertainty that you have. In the review of the literature that we did, something that I just didn't go into, is that it seems to be the epistemic uncertainty that seems to be associated with dsPFC. Aleatory uncertainty tends to be represented or associated with activations more posteriorly in ACC, in pre-SMA, a few other regions, but what seems to be the case, if there's some type of uncertainty that explains dsPFC activation, it seems to be this epistemic type. Now, you could say, even within the epistemic uncertainty category, I've only captured a tiny, tiny portion of that space. So empirically, I have no idea whether this region responds, to uncertainty in other types of tasks. And I think the answer to that question is going to depend on an understanding of what we think dsPFC is doing. What I can say is that we don't think it's responding purely to the subjective feeling of uncertainty. And I have hypotheses about what it might be doing, but those are not yet tested. So I think on an empirical basis, I don't know. On a theoretical basis, my guess is that it will track with uncertainty that can be reduced cognitively. So we have some evidence that the sorts of things that track with uncertainty go away when you provide information that allows people to bypass the need to do sort of cognitive uncertainty reduction. So whether you want to call that sort of episodic simulation or something related to making predictions based on internal information, those are the cases where my guess, to be determined, is that we're going to see activation related to uncertainty in this region. Yeah, it's a great question.
Alex.
Thank you. So thank you, Anna. That was great. So you started out with this notion from the literature that there's this idea of a social brain with a dedicated set of regions, and you convincingly showed us that dorsal medial prefrontal cortex should no longer be included. But you're still left with a set of regions, and there's debate of, maybe are there other regions, so on. But I'm just wondering, do you think it's still useful to talk about a dedicated network in the brain that you can say it's these areas that are the social brain? Is this a useful idea anymore?
Yeah. Thank you. Beautiful question. So is it still useful to talk about the social brain and to include dsPFC in that set of regions, or should we excommunicate dsPFC from the social brain? So I think there are two different purposes, at least, for which we might want to refer to something like a social brain. And if what we want to refer to is what is the set of regions from which we infer a set of processes or representations that tend to be engaged when people navigate their social worlds, then absolutely, because clearly dsPFC is consistently engaged when people navigate their social worlds. There's another set of reasons why we might want to call something the social brain, and that's to target our exploration of what might be going differently in conditions of atypical social behavior. And so there, if you're looking for domain-specific deficits, but the underlying processes aren't domain-specific, you're going to hit a roadblock. And so I think it's mostly in that second case where it's useful to distinguish, is this region part of the social brain because of something social per se, or is it part of the social brain because of something more domain general? And then we can target our exploration of what might be going differently in atypical social cognition in a way that isn't limited by the assumption of social specificity.
Thank you, Anna. It was great. I have two questions. One is very, very short. You used the human physical task as a contrast, but you also had a furniture task. So I wonder if you were contrasting furniture and...
Yes.
Is there a humanness?
I glossed over that a little bit. No. So in the main analyses I showed you, those are responses collapsing across condition, which is to say a response to uncertainty disregarding condition, but then also within each condition individually. Then I showed you to test this possibility that when we compare as tightly as possible mental versus non-mental in the human domain, do we see 𝗔𝗶H activation? And the answer is no, suggesting that uncertainty accounts for 𝗔𝗶H activation. This is the only place where I only compared
I know.
personality versus human physical. So in the other cases, we see parametric response to uncertainty in the furniture condition.
I understand. I was just wondering if you were to contrast human personality with the furniture question, whether you would get some, irrespective of uncertainty.
Oh, okay, yes. So if we contrast human personality versus furniture, just in a contrast, or you mean the parametric effect of uncertainty?
Like this one.
Yes, you see the tiniest, it's the tiniest bit of 𝗔𝗶H. So it basically looks like this, but just shifted up slightly. We have reason to think that our manipulation of uncertainty in the furniture condition wasn't quite as strong, which is very, very frustrating. I mean, if you look at the ratings, there's nothing overtly problematic about it, but the correlations are a little bit weaker in the furniture condition, and intuitively, not these correlations, but the ability the space of possible uncertainty around attributes of furniture just isn't as great as we might want it to be in order to have an ideal comparison. So unfortunately, it's difficult for me to interpret that comparison between personality and furniture because I'm not totally confident that we manipulated uncertainty as in a way that is absolutely perfectly controlled. We got close.
If I have, okay. One simple question. So you know the literature on impression formation on an importance of congruency, congruent behaviors, incongruent behaviors, neutral behaviors.
Yes.
And a question that I have for you is, it seems like you're suggesting that the MPFC would not necessarily care about, if you strip out uncertainty in a social situation, then maybe you wouldn't respond. So if you go into this impression formation literature, and you were to use congruent behaviors, which are no longer uncertain. I mean, if you have an impression of someone, and it's just a congruent behavior, then, there's not a lot of uncertainty. Obviously, they would do that. Versus a neutral behavior, which is actually a lot more uncertain, but less socially congruent, you would not see an effect here. Is that what you're suggesting?
It's interesting. So I think the answer to that depends, again, on what exactly we think it is that is driving the 𝗔𝗶H response to uncertainty. So if we think of 𝗔𝗶H as just an uncertainty meter, then I think everything you said is exactly what we would predict. I don't think I'm thinking of 𝗔𝗶H as an uncertainty meter. I think I'm thinking of uncertainty as something that is driving the engagement of whatever 𝗔𝗶H is doing to help resolve the uncertainty. And so then my predictions would depend on to what extent is whatever that process is needed to answer the question. And I predict that would be highly correlated with uncertainty, but is there some other way that you might, let's just say it's simulation, which is not exactly what I think it is, but for purposes of having a word, there might be other ways to create situations that are controlled for uncertainty, but nonetheless, evoke more simulation in one versus the other, and then, again, with simulation as a placeholder for what this region might be doing, then I would still expect to see a greater response. Does that make sense?
We got one here, and then Alfonso is going to ask you about what you mean by uncertainty.
Thank you. Beautiful talk. Yeah, I also had a question about the uncertainty. So I was thinking, if you zoom out a bit and look at other domains, such as, for example, language, you see that there, if you're more uncertain, it typically leads to an upregulation of processing in the language areas. And in perceptual decisions, if you have a harder perceptual decision, it's more uncertain, you get more engagement of the areas involved in that perceptual decision. So in other words, I would say that typically uncertainty would modulate sort of the regions that are actually involved in the content about which you are uncertain. So in the light of that, I was curious why your social brain is actually not modulated by uncertainty when it comes to the social stimuli. So what's your explanation for that?
That's so interesting. I need to think about that. So the idea is basically in other sorts of domains, greater uncertainty just increases activity in the regions that are associated with whatever the computations are in those domains. And so the fact that we don't see a response to uncertainty in other regions of the social brain makes you wonder, does it make you wonder, have we really manipulated uncertainty, or are we really studying social thinking?
Well, it could be either of those, yeah. I'm wondering, my guess would be that maybe there would be other forms of uncertainty that maybe that those regions are responding to. But in general, my sort of default hypothesis would be that if you are more uncertain about certain content, that would lead to sort of like more processing in the regions that are involved in that content. So
yeah, I mean, so one possible interpretation is just that the way that regions associated with social cognition respond to uncertainty is different, actually, in the sense of, maybe in some of those other domains, it's more like, oh, there are multiple possibilities that are already there that you're holding in mind, and you have to arbitrate between them or among them, as opposed to you need to generate de novo, some representation of what might be true, and so it might be more about generating that representation as opposed to choosing among existing ones or something like that. So I think there could be a variety of possible differences between what make a social cognitive inference versus when you're doing something in the language domain, for example, that could account for it. But I don't think our data can provide an answer at this stage. Yeah.
Right, but maybe just, so you don't think that you need more work if you're more uncertain, so that if you're uncertain in a social sense, then your social brain areas basically need to work harder?
Yeah, I think you need more of certain types of work, right? And that might not track perfectly linearly with uncertainty. Maybe if you're not at all uncertain, you don't need very much work of a certain type. Let's again just say simulation again. I don't think that's a perfect capturing of what it is, but maybe if uncertainty is super low, you don't need to engage that process at all. And if uncertainty is super high, engaging that process won't get you anywhere, so you also don't engage it. But there might be some intermediate level of uncertainty, and maybe we're capturing kind of this portion of the, of the uncertainty space, across which greater uncertainty is going to engage some process for resolving that uncertainty more. So maybe what the other regions of the social brain are doing are not this sort of constructive resolution of incomplete information, but more like how, representing something that could be incompatible with something else, or, a lot of work obviously still needs to be done to understand what the contributions of other brain regions might be, but I guess I would just say that based on what we know from the social brain, there's good reason to think that not all of the regions of the social brain are doing the same thing, and they might be modulated in different ways by uncertainty, where some of them might need to do more work and others might not. But thank you for the question. Yeah.
Oh, beautiful talk. He asked my question, so I thought of reframing it from the other side. That is, in what sense might there be a processing of uncertainty? Mm-hmm. I mean, it doesn't seem to be. It's a different kind of concept that is being used. We process visual representations, we have things about memory. This is not a claim about a content, but rather about a level of something.
Yeah.
Does it bother you, or does it sort of give you an insight into some of the way of thinking about what this brain is doing?
It energizes what I assume will be the rest of my career trying to answer the question. But yeah, so I don't think that it's about the subjective feeling of uncertainty. There are other regions that we know about that can do those sorts of things. One thing that I think is potentially consistent with the evidence that we have is that this region might be doing something about abstraction or relying on more abstract representations that allow you to generalize across things that are further apart. So the more similar two things are, the more concretely one might inform your understanding of another, but the further apart they are, the more you might need to form abstract representations in order to bridge, use what you know from context one to inform your predictions about context two. And so possibly something having to do with abstraction, but that's about as far as I can speculate.
Right. Wouldn't that then sort of lead you to think that these areas would be connected with a bunch of different kinds of domains? Mm-hmm. So you would actually predict that, I don't know what the connectivity in these areas looks like, but that these areas would be connected with language areas, with visual areas, with whatever areas,
yes.
Given that what seems to be happening, the way you interpret it, is that it captures something about uncertainty in computation, which applies to every domain.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree with that. I think well, so we know that these regions, in a totally, mostly independent, I guess I would say, there's some meta-analyses that connect them, mostly independent literature, these regions are associated with episodic memory and future thinking, right? And so there might be really important similarities in what you need to do to bridge from your own current first-person experience to predict what, how much you're going to enjoy your gelato tomorrow afternoon, as what, when you predict how much, Alex is going to enjoy his gelato tomorrow afternoon. I constructed those to be overly similar, but I completely agree that we wanted to capture this in a very specific way that allowed us some pretty tight controls, but my suspicion is that this region is doing something very general that applies across many domains of thought and behavior, including future thinking and social cognition.
Thank you, great talk. It's just a guess question. Like, would you think this area could be some way altered in cases of intolerance to uncertainty, for example? So, in the abstract way that you were telling about before, I see how this area could be maybe malfunctioning or in a network malfunctioning. So it could be that people with high intolerance to uncertainty could not be able to resolve through this point in the network the uncertainty in the world.
Yes, thank you for the question. We are now measuring intolerance to uncertainty in the studies that we're running, and I think that's especially relevant as it connects to some of the clinical conditions for which this might be important. So we know, for example, that both autism and social anxiety show relationships to intolerance to uncertainty, both in the positive direction, and whether that stems from challenges resolving uncertainty, we don't know well, but to me that seems like a very coherent story, that if the processes that you use to try to resolve uncertainty are atypical or result in atypical outputs, or don't result in something that actually reduces your uncertainty, that could lead to uncertainty aversion. I mean, that's a very tentative idea, but we do see that relationship in social anxiety and in autism. And in some of the other work that I alluded to in about 2 seconds at the very end, we've been looking at the relationship between uncertainty and exploration behavior, finding that the sort of assumed elevated uncertainty in social context is associated with more exploration as opposed to exploitation of rewards in social context, such that people actually get lower rewards overall in social contexts compared to matched non-social ones. And there we have just started looking at individual differences in intolerance to uncertainty. And we, I wish, it's a whole different talk. There are some very promising relationships. We don't know exactly how much that leads to people wanting to resolve the uncertainty more or people wanting to disengage from it entirely, and that I think is going to be a really interesting line of inquiry.
If I may, I see on the other side of the spectrum the relation with curiosity maybe, and the curiosity level and all these works about the studies about curiosity. So when you are more curious, probably you have more, you're looking for this kind of resolving of uncertainty.
Right, so you might make a prediction if intolerance to uncertainty might be associated with less engagement of these sorts of processes, maybe curiosity would be associated with more engagement of these processes to try to resolve the uncertainty.
Yes, the other way around, I would say. So the uncertainty, so the avoiding of uncertainty, it means that maybe you need more work to resolve the uncertainty. So it's more stressful for your system to, it's a more higher cognitive load for you and leads to anxiety and everything.
Yes, I think this comes back to the idea that the relationship between uncertainty and sort of the motivation to resolve it might not be perfectly linear, and different people might have different thresholds at which they decide this is so uncertain, there's no hope, right? So I think those sorts of relationships we very much still need to disentangle, but I agree that it's a very interesting direction.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have time for a couple more questions. Certainly encourage students, please, to ask questions if you have them. While you're thinking of a question, oh, we got Steve. I'm going to call on myself first, though, because I just wanted to follow up and ask you. I was thinking that, you know, when you're in an uncertain situation, like uncertainty always takes a referent, right? You're uncertain about something.
Yeah.
And, but sometimes when you're really uncertain, it's really, you're kind of like introspective. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if the more uncertain you are, the more introspective you are. And, you know, I'm thinking like these are like the default mode areas also. And if you attend to something out in the world, their activation drops, and as you kind of wander and think about what you're going to do, their activation kind of comes back up. And so it's like introspection versus extrospection. I don't know, extrospection?
Yes. Yeah, so one of the, I mean, as you alluded to, one of the consistent findings about the set of regions associated with mentalizing is that it is also more active when people think about themselves than other people. In fact, thinking about the self is one of the surest ways to get high activity in this network. And then there's sort of a, you know, in other work I didn't talk about today, we have evidence that there's sort of a gradation down from self through, you know, similar others to dissimilar others, et cetera, in at least the more ventral aspects of the DMPFC. There's some evidence that the dorsal aspect of the VMPFC might move in somewhat opposing ways to the more ventral portion, with the more dorsal portion being associated with reasoning about dissimilar others and people who are further from self. So I think that actually coincides pretty nicely with the uncertainty findings, and it's actually more certainty that's associated with the more ventral region. So I don't think, if the question is, can introspection explain away the uncertainty effect, I don't think it can, because the results mostly go sort of in opposite directions with respect to the MPFC subregions. But that said, I think that there's probably a lot more commonality in the processes that people use for introspection and the processes that they use for uncertainty reduction, kind of to Alfonso's point, than we've previously acknowledged.
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to ask a similar question about the certainty effect in the VMPFC. So what do you think is going on there? That's sort of the reverse of what.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, we've been focused on the DMPFC effect and the fact that activity there seems to be, that elevated activity there that's been so consistently observed in past studies seems to be explained away by uncertainty. But the VMPFC response in the opposite direction is interesting. That does accord broadly with VMPFC's role in things that are, you know, valued, things that are familiar, et cetera. So what the computations are or the processes, I definitely don't know, but it's not aberrant in the sense of other findings that could broadly be interpreted as associated with things that are more familiar, which might be less certain.
Is it selective to the animate, or do you see this effect?
This is across all categories. Yeah, off the top of my head, I don't remember for VMPFC when we directly compare, you know, human versus furniture, human physical versus furniture, but it definitely, it tracks with uncertainty across each category independently. Would you predict that it would track with the human more than the furniture?
Of the two areas there in autism, the ventral medium prefrontal is the one that is more associated with autism.
Yeah, well, it's also, so there's this region, this particular ROI captures a lot of cortex that might be combining both the sort of more value-based areas and things that aren't really what people would typically refer to as VMPFC. They're like the ventral aspect of the MPFC as opposed to, anyway. So we might be combining a variety of different processes in that particular ROI. We used it because that was defined from past research as responding more to social versus non-social, but it could be really interesting to look into further subregions of that area.
Okay, hi. when you first talked about food cravings related to lack of social behavior, it made me think about social networks, because it's a very hot topic now, and research about connecting social networks, like using social networks to the mentalizing system, so these areas in the brain. And I was wondering what's your take on like this uncertainty in using social networks, because we can also say that in a way it reduces uncertainty because we can search for anything. So I was curious about your take on this.
Yeah, so uncertainty in social networks, it's a really interesting area. So one possible relationship that I think is intriguing is that it might be the case. Well, so first of all, there, which you may or may know, there are studies showing that activity and structure in the medial prefrontal cortex is associated with social network size. And so one possible way of explaining that under the uncertainty heading is, the better you are at resolving uncertainty, the more people in your network you might be able to tolerate. So going back to that messy plot of all of these different relationships that people have to keep track of, the more readily or the more effectively a person can resolve uncertainty about other people's intentions and plans and reasons behind their behaviors, the more they might be able to sustain a larger social network, or that could make interesting predictions about sort of centrality in social networks that we haven't tested at all, but would be really interesting to explore.
All right, well, we'll let that be the last word. Right. Thank you so much, Anna.
Thanks for the question.